Tonight we're going somewhere cold. Salem Village, Massachusetts. January 1692. Picture it. Snow on the ground, hard and gray. The kind of cold that gets into the walls of a house, that makes the fire feel like it barely matters, that makes the world outside feel very dark and very large and very indifferent. A community of roughly 550 people, most of them farmers, most of them deeply religious, all of them living in close quarters with their neighbors, their livestock, their grievances, and their God. In the parsonage of the Reverend Samuel Parris, a house that was itself a source of local resentment, because some in the congregation had argued they should not have to pay for its upkeep, two young girls have started behaving strangely. Betty Parris is 9 years old. She is the minister's daughter. She is having fits. Her cousin Abigail Williams is 11, an orphaned niece living in the household. She is having fits too. Convulsions. Screaming. Their bodies folding and contorting in ways that make the people watching them feel a cold that has nothing to do with the winter outside. They say they are being pinched, bitten, that invisible hands are at their throats. The local doctor, William Griggs, examines both girls and finds nothing physically wrong with either of them. He offers the only other explanation that makes sense to him. The devil, he says, is at work here. And with those words, a community of 550 people begins to tear itself apart. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome to the Still Hour. This is the channel for slow, late-night history told like a story by someone who genuinely cannot stop thinking about this stuff. And if you have been here before, you already know how this goes. Hit that like button. It helps more people find this channel, and I am genuinely grateful every time you do. Subscribe so you don't miss part 2 of this, because trust me, it gets worse before it gets better. And if someone suggested this topic, thank you. The comment sections on this channel are genuinely some of the most interesting reading on the internet. People sharing where they are, what they're doing, what they thought of the history. Drop a comment tonight. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Tell me if you're in bed, on the couch, in your car, wherever you end up listening. I genuinely read them. I genuinely love knowing that someone in a different corner of the world is sitting with this history at 2 in the morning, the same way I am. Turn off the lights. Pull the blanket up. And think about what it would feel like to live in a world where the things you couldn't explain had to be someone's fault. Where fear needed a face. Where your neighbor's bad luck could become your death sentence. Where you woke up every morning inside a theology that told you the devil was real and active and looking for a way in, and that every unexplained thing, every illness, every accident, every crop failure, every nightmare, might be evidence that he had found one. Think about what it does to a person to live inside that kind of certainty. Think about what it does to a community. Now, before we get into the history, I want to sit with some questions. Because this is the kind of story that does not resolve cleanly. It does not give you a simple villain and a simple explanation and a tidy lesson. It gives you something much harder and much more uncomfortable. What makes ordinary people accuse their neighbors of impossible things? Were the girls lying? Were they genuinely suffering? Were they experiencing something that we would now recognize and name, something psychological, something neurological, something that the world of 1692 had no language for and no framework to contain? What happens when an entire community decides, collectively, that it is surrounded by evil, and that the only way forward is to find it and name it and destroy it? What does it feel like to be accused of something you did not do, in a court that has already decided you are guilty, in a community where you have lived your entire life, among people who know your name and your children's names and the size of your land? Why did it take so long for anyone to say stop? There were voices, we will find them. There were people who looked at what was happening and said this is wrong, this has gone too far. What happened to those voices? Why were they so easy to ignore? Who benefited from the accusations? Because someone always benefits. Fear is never entirely random. It lands somewhere. Who did it land on here, and why? And the question that genuinely haunts historians, the one that keeps the story alive after 300 years, is this. Could it happen again? Not exactly like this, not with the same theology, not with the same court and the same specific logic, but something with the same shape. A community under stress, identifying a scapegoat, building a system of accusation that makes itself immune to evidence. Something that feels, from the inside, entirely righteous. We will come back to that question at the end. For now, let us go to Salem, New England, 1692. And I need you to understand this world before we can understand what happened in it. Not to excuse it, what happened at Salem was a genuine atrocity, and we will not flinch from that. But to comprehend it, to make the people in it real rather than caricatures. Salem was not one place. There was Salem town, the prosperous merchant port, the kind of place where money moved and ships came in. And then there was Salem village, about 5 miles away, a farming community, poorer, more isolated, less connected to the wider world. The people of Salem village were in an uneasy administrative relationship with Salem town, dependent on it in ways that bred resentment. They had been trying to establish their own independent church for decades. They had gone through several ministers before they settled, uneasily and not unanimously, on the Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris was a businessman before he was a minister. He had spent time in Barbados managing a plantation he never quite made work, and when that failed, he turned to the church. He was not a man who inspired widespread warmth. He was demanding. He insisted on owning the parsonage outright rather than renting it. He pressed the congregation hard on salaries and firewood and the various material comforts he felt his position deserved. A significant faction of Salem village resented him deeply and was withholding his salary and firewood at the very moment his daughter and niece began having fits. This is a community already under stress, already divided, already fighting over land and money and status and who was going to be in charge. The first fit happened in January 1692. But everything that made it catastrophic had been building for years. Chapter 1. The Puritan World. Let's talk about what it actually meant to be a Puritan in 1692 Massachusetts, because I think we tend to flatten these people in our imagination. We think of them as severe and joyless and slightly ridiculous, with their buckle hats and their witch trials, and we use the word Puritan as a synonym for repressed and humorless. And then we miss entirely what was genuinely extraordinary about them, and genuinely terrifying, and genuinely comprehensible. The Puritans were not stupid. This is the first thing I need you to hold on to. These were not ignorant peasants who believed in magic because they did not know any better. Many of them were educated. They had ministers who had studied at Cambridge, who could read Latin and Greek and Hebrew, who wrote serious theology and read widely and thought hard about the nature of God and the nature of man. What they had was a coherent worldview, a total worldview, one that explained everything, that had an answer for every question, that left no ambiguity about what the universe was and what your place in it was and what was expected of you. And the architecture of that worldview is the architecture of the Salem tragedy. At the center of Puritan theology was a God of absolute sovereignty. Not a warm, reassuring deity. A God who was just, yes, but whose justice was not particularly interested in your comfort. The Puritans believed in predestination, the idea that God had already determined, before you were born, whether you were one of the elect, one of the saved, or one of the damned. You did not earn salvation by good works. You either had it or you did not. And the agonizing thing was that you could not know for certain which category you were in. You could look for signs. You could examine your conscience endlessly. You could pray and fast and observe the Sabbath and behave in every externally visible way as a good Christian. But in the end, it was God's choice, not yours. The uncertainty was permanent and it was supposed to be humbling, and it was certainly terrifying. Into this uncertainty, the devil was very real. Not metaphorically real. Not symbolically real. Actually, concretely, operationally real. The Puritans believed that Satan walked in the world, that he made deals with people, that he offered power and comfort in exchange for the soul, that he was actively and constantly working to corrupt the godly, to tempt the weak, to undermine the great project of building a godly society in the New England wilderness. This was not a fairy tale to them. This was current events, and the New England wilderness itself was part of this theology. The Puritans had come to America with a mission. They were building a city on a hill, a model Christian commonwealth that would show the corrupt old world what a truly godly society could look like. They were doing God's work. And the wilderness around them, with its cold and its unpredictability and its indigenous people who did not share their religion, felt like resistance. Like the devil's territory. Like something that was actively hostile to their project. They had a name for this. They called it spiritual warfare. Now think about what daily life looked like inside this theology. You wake up before dawn on a winter morning in Salem Village, Massachusetts. The fire needs to be rebuilt. The animals need to be tended. The children need to be watched. Your world is entirely local. Your farm, your neighbors' farms, the meeting house where you gather on Sunday, the paths between them. You know everyone around you by name. You have known them your whole life. You know who borrowed your father's plow and did not return it in good condition. You know who has been spreading rumors about your family. You know whose land borders yours and whether the survey was honest. These things matter because in a community this small and this isolated, with no real legal recourse for most disputes and no real privacy and no real escape, everything is personal and everything is permanent. On Sunday you go to church, and it is not optional, and it is not brief. Services could last several hours. The sermon was the center of intellectual life, the center of emotional life, the center of community life. The minister was the most educated person most of these people ever encountered. What he said mattered. What he said about the state of the community, about the presence of sin, about the danger of the devil, that was not one opinion among many. That was authoritative interpretation of the universe. And the Puritan theology of sin was exhaustive. Sin was not just murder and theft and adultery. Sin was pride. Sin was envy. Sin was any enjoyment of life that wasn't properly grateful. Sin was dancing, sometimes. Sin was celebrating Christmas, because Christmas had become too Catholic, too pagan, too ornate. Sin was, if you were not careful, almost everything pleasurable. And if you sinned, you were not just morally failing. You were giving the devil purchase. You were opening a door. The community policed itself. Your neighbors watched you. The church watched you. If your behavior deviated from what was expected, if you were too loud, too proud, too sexually unconventional, too litigious, too strange, too anything, you were noticed. And in a world where the devil was real and active, someone who was too strange or too unconventional was not just a social annoyance. They were a potential threat, a potential vessel. This is the world in which two little girls started having fits in January 1692. And when the doctor said the devil was at work, he wasn't being sensational. He was applying the standard diagnostic framework. Within the Puritan worldview, it was the most logical conclusion available to him. What else could it be? I want you to sit with that for a moment. The terrifying thing about Salem is not that it was done by people who were crazy or stupid or uniquely evil. It was done by people who were operating completely rationally within their system of beliefs. Every step that followed was logical, given the premises. The horror was not in the logic. The horror was in the premises. Chapter 2. The Girls. Betty Paris was 9 years old. I want you to hold that number for a second. 9 years old. Living in her father's house, which was also her father's church, which was also the center of a community conflict that she was certainly aware of because children are always aware of things adults think they are not. Her father was unpopular. There were people in the village who refused to take communion from him, who publicly disputed his authority, who made clear in a dozen small daily ways that they did not consider the Paris family entirely welcome. Betty grew up inside that. Abigail Williams was 11, and her situation was in some ways even more precarious. She was an orphan, living in the Paris household not as a daughter but as a niece, which in the hierarchical world of Puritan Massachusetts was a meaningful distinction. She was dependent, in a very real material way, on a man who was himself in an uncertain position. She had no parents to advocate for her, no home of her own, no clear future. At 11, she would have understood something of this. Their fits began in January 1692, though the exact date is uncertain. What is described is genuinely disturbing to read, even now. They would fall into sudden convulsions. They would crawl under furniture and try to climb the walls. They would bark and yelp and scream. They would go rigid and then collapse. They would cry out that they were being pinched, bitten, that invisible forces were tormenting them. They reported visions, shapes, forms, presences. The household was terrified. Reverend Paris was terrified. He called in the local minister, John Hale, and they prayed over the girls. They called in the doctor, William Griggs. And when Griggs could find no physical cause, he said what everyone was already thinking: witchcraft. But here is the question that has occupied historians, psychologists, doctors, and writers for 3 centuries. What was actually wrong with these girls? There are several serious theories, and I want to give them all their fair weight. The first possibility is deliberate deception. The girls were lying. They had discovered, or perhaps stumbled into, a form of behavior that produced a dramatic and immediate response from the adults around them. The attention, the concern, the power. In a world where children, especially girls, had almost no power over anything, an accusation was a kind of agency. Some historians lean toward this view, pointing to the way the fits seemed to start and stop at convenient moments, to the way the accusations shifted and expanded with what seemed like calculation. The second possibility is genuine psychological distress. Something we would now call a conversion disorder, or a dissociative episode, or mass psychogenic illness. A real, involuntary response to psychological stress, manifesting in physical symptoms that look like they could be caused by something external. Betty Paris was a 9-year-old living in a household under considerable stress, in a theology that told her the devil was looking for a way in. She may have genuinely believed she was being tormented. She may have experienced something real and terrible without any external cause at all. The third possibility, which gained significant attention in the 1970s thanks to the researcher Linda Caporael and which has been both defended and challenged ever since, is ergotism. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain in certain cold, wet conditions that would have been present in Salem in 1691. Ergot poisoning can produce convulsions, hallucinations, sensations of being bitten or pinched. It could explain the physical symptoms. The counterargument is that the symptoms spread in ways that are hard to explain by a single contaminated grain supply, and that the social patterns of the accusations don't map cleanly onto a poisoning event. The fourth theory, and the one I find most humanly interesting, is that it started as something and then became something else. Perhaps Betty genuinely felt ill. Perhaps Abigail, living in the same household, caught the fear and the behavior the way you catch an emotion, the way children in close quarters catch each other's distress. Perhaps what started as real symptoms was then amplified, consciously or not, as the girls discovered the extraordinary power their behavior gave them. Perhaps there is no single answer because there was no single cause. Perhaps the honest answer is, we don't know. What we do know is that other girls began showing the same symptoms within weeks. Ann Putnam Jr. was 12, the daughter of a prominent family in the village who had their own complicated relationship with power and land and local politics. Mary Walcott was 17, connected to the Putnam family by friendship and proximity. Elizabeth Hubbard was 17, a servant in the household of Dr. Griggs, the very doctor who had made the first diagnosis of witchcraft. Mercy Lewis was 19, a servant in the Putnam household who had survived an attack on her previous employer's family in the ongoing conflict with indigenous peoples on the frontier. She was a young woman who had already seen things that no one should see. Mary Warren was 20, a servant in the household of John Proctor. Susanna Sheldon was 18. I want you to notice something about this group. Several of them are servants. Several of them are teenagers without families of their own, or in precarious household positions, or in complicated relationships with the people who employed them and controlled their daily lives. Several of them have connections to the Putnam family, which will become significant. Most of them are female, in a world that gave female voices very little formal weight. And then suddenly they were the most listened to voices in the entire community. I don't say this to be cynical. I say it because it matters. Power flows somewhere. When it is denied to people by the normal channels, it finds other channels. What happened in Salem was not simply cynical performance. I don't think most of these girls were cold-blooded liars calculating how to destroy their neighbors. But I also don't think the human dynamics of power and attention and the intoxicating experience of suddenly being believed and centered were entirely absent. Human beings are complicated. These girls were human beings. Chapter 3. The First Accusations. On the last day of February 1692, 3 women were formally accused of witchcraft. The names were Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Look at those 3 names and think about what they had in common. Tituba was an enslaved woman in the Paris household. Her exact origins are debated. She was described as Indian in the court records, which in 1692 could have meant a number of things, but the most widely accepted scholarly view now is that she was of Caribbean origin, likely from Barbados, and may have been of African or indigenous Barbadian descent, or some combination. She had come to New England with Samuel Parris when he left Barbados. She was not free. She had no legal standing. She was, in every possible way, the most vulnerable person in the entire community. Sarah Good was a beggar. She had been born into modest prosperity, but her father had died and the estate had been mishandled, and she had ended up married to a man in debt, living in poverty, dependent on the charity of the community she had once been equal to. She was known to go from house to house asking for food and shelter, and when she was refused, which was often, she would leave muttering under her breath. Muttering was noted. In a world where words had power and the devil worked through them, a woman who muttered darkly as she left your property was alarming. She had a young child and an infant. She was universally regarded as difficult. Sarah Osborne had not attended church in over a year. In Puritan Massachusetts, this was not a neutral act. You attended church. Attendance was both a religious requirement and a social contract. It was how you demonstrated your membership in the community, your commitment to the shared project. To stop attending was to withdraw from that contract in a visible and deliberate way. Osborne also had a complicated domestic situation. After her first husband died, she had eventually married an indentured servant, a younger man, a relationship the community found unseemly. She was also in a dispute with the Putnam family over land belonging to her first husband's estate. Are you seeing the pattern? An enslaved woman with no legal standing. A homeless beggar. An older woman who had stopped attending church and was involved in a land dispute with a powerful family. The first accused were not chosen at random. They were the people the community already regarded with suspicion, unease, or contempt. They were the people who could be accused without the accusation immediately seeming absurd. They were, in the most precise and specific sense, the most marginalized people in Salem village. The hearings before the magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin began on the 1st of March. And what happened at those hearings was a masterpiece of a closed system. Hathorne did not ask neutral questions. He asked questions that assumed guilt. Why do you hurt these children? Not, did you hurt these children? But the framework was established before the accused opened their mouths. Sarah Good denied everything and pointed her finger at Sarah Osborne. Sarah Osborne denied everything. And then Tituba spoke. Tituba's confession is one of the most extraordinary documents in American history, and I say that with complete sincerity. Because what Tituba produced, under what conditions exactly we will never know, but her husband John Indian later showed the magistrates what appeared to be marks on his body from being beaten, suggesting the household was not exactly providing a supportive environment for resistance, was a story that answered every question the Puritan worldview was asking. She described meeting a tall man who came to her in the night. A tall man who told her to hurt the children, and who told her to write her name in his book, a book in which she said she saw 9 other names already written. She described a yellow bird. She described red cats and black cats. She described a creature that was part wolf and part human. She described flying on a stick. She described seeing a woman and then another woman, and then knowing that these women were also in service to the devil. She named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne as fellow witches. But why did Tituba confess? This question matters enormously. One theory is that she was coached, that someone, perhaps Parris himself, fed her the details of what a witch's confession should sound like, and she provided it to protect herself. Another theory is that she was beaten or threatened until she said what her captors wanted to hear. Another theory, taken seriously by some scholars, is that Tituba did genuinely believe in spiritual forces, that she came from a cultural tradition that included supernatural beings and encounters with spirits, and that her confession was a sincere attempt to describe something in her experience through the framework being offered to her. Another theory is that she was simply a very smart woman in an impossible position who recognized that confession meant survival and denial meant death. Here is what we know with certainty. Every person who denied being a witch in Salem was eventually executed. Every person who confessed and named others was allowed to live. Tituba survived. Her confession was the spark that set everything on fire. Because now it was not just the afflicted girls saying there were witches in Salem. It was a self-confessed witch saying there were other witches. The book with 9 names in it. 9 other people in service to the devil, walking around Salem village, tormenting children. Who were the other names in the book? The community needed to know. And here is the terrible engine of what followed. Once you accept the framework, once you accept that there are witches in the community, that the devil has recruited agents from among your neighbors, that the afflicted girls are telling the truth about what they are experiencing, then the only rational thing to do is find all of the witches. To stop at 3 would be dangerous. Incomplete. If the book had 9 names, 9 was the minimum. And if 9, why not more? The devil was not lazy. The devil had been working the New England wilderness for decades. The investigation could only expand. The logic of the situation guaranteed it. Chapter 4. The Spread. By the end of May 1692, over 60 people had been accused. By the end of the summer, the number would exceed 200. I want to walk you through the mechanism of this, because it is not chaos. It is a terrible, almost elegant logic. Once the framework is established, once the community has accepted that there are witches among them, the framework becomes self-sustaining, and it does so by making every possible response to an accusation into evidence of guilt. You are accused of witchcraft. What are your options? You can deny it. Denial means you are lying, which means the devil has made you a liar to protect himself, which means you are guilty. Denial was evidence. You can confess. Confession proves you are a witch. But confessors who named other witches were generally not executed. They were kept alive because they were useful. They provided new names. So confession was the only rational survival strategy. You can cry out against your accuser, say that the accusation is false, that the girls are lying or deluded. Several people did this. They were accused of additional witchcraft, because obviously a witch would try to discredit the people exposing them. You can have a good reputation in the community, be known as a godly person, have your minister and your neighbors speak well of you. This helped briefly. And then it stopped helping, because the devil was cunning, and what better cover for a witch than a reputation for godliness? Rebecca Nurse had a reputation for godliness. She was hanged. You can flee. Some people did. They mostly stayed gone and were attainted in their absence. There is no option that is safe. Every move confirms the framework. This is the mark of a system that has made itself immune to counter-evidence. The accused cannot offer any evidence of their innocence, because every piece of potential evidence has been pre-interpreted as evidence of guilt. In May 1692, the governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips, arrived from England with a new royal charter and found the jails overflowing with accused witches and no real court to try them. He established the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The name comes from the French, meaning to hear and to determine. It was a special court, constituted specifically to deal with the witch crisis, with 9 judges and a formidable legal apparatus. And it admitted spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is the doctrine that a person's specter, their spirit, their projection, could act independently of their physical body. So the afflicted girls could testify that they saw the specter of a named person doing harm to them, and that testimony was admitted as evidence of witchcraft, even if the named person was physically somewhere else at the time. Even if they had witnesses who could prove their physical location. Their body might have been in the next town. Their specter might still have been in the courtroom, tormenting children. Do you understand what this means? It means the accused had no alibi. There was no possible alibi. A person could not prove that their specter had not done something. You cannot offer evidence about the whereabouts of your specter. You have no access to your specter. Your specter is not under your control, or if it is, that control is itself evidence that you have made a deal with the devil who gave you that power. Spectral evidence made the system hermetically sealed against defense. It was a machine for producing convictions. And there were those who said so. There were ministers, even at the time, who wrote that spectral evidence was insufficient grounds for conviction. Cotton Mather, who is often cast as the villain of Salem and was certainly a complicated and frequently infuriating figure, actually warned against over-reliance on spectral evidence even as he affirmed the existence of witchcraft and attended at least one hanging with what reads as disturbing enthusiasm. Thomas Brattle, a respected Boston merchant and intellectual, wrote a letter in October 1692 describing the trials as a disgrace and the evidence as laughable. Increase Mather, Cotton's father and one of the most powerful ministers in Massachusetts, eventually published a pamphlet arguing that it was better for 10 witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. These voices existed. They were not silent. They were also, for months, not enough. Because the court had momentum and the community had fear, and fear is extraordinarily resistant to reasoned argument. The people running the trials were not cartoonish monsters twirling their mustaches. They were people who genuinely believed they were confronting a real supernatural conspiracy against their community, and that the cost of being wrong in the direction of mercy, of letting a witch go free, was eternal souls in peril. When the stakes are framed that way, caution looks like complicity. And there was something else. Something uglier and more earthly. The accusations were not random. Look at who accused whom. The Putnam family and their associates were responsible for a significant number of the accusations. And Putnam Sr., the mother of the afflicted and Junior, was herself an accuser. And the people the Putnams accused were, in a striking number of cases, people in property disputes with the Putnams, people aligned with factions in Salem Village that opposed the Putnams, people who represented competing interests in the community's ongoing battles over land and power and status. I'm not saying the Salem witch trials were purely a land grab. That would be too simple. The fear was real. The suffering of the afflicted girls was real, whatever its cause. The theology was sincere. But the human and material interests that shaped which direction the accusations flew, those were also real. Fear and greed and grievance do not cancel each other out. They compound. By the summer of 1692, the machinery was running hot. The court of Oyer and Terminer was hearing cases regularly. The jails of Salem were so overcrowded that prisoners were dying in them, not from execution, just from the conditions, the cold, the disease, the weight of their chains. Accused people sat in those jails for months, waiting. Some of them had confessed and were alive but ruined. Some of them were maintaining their innocence and moving toward death. And one by one, the hangings began. Chapter 5. The Accused. Let me tell you about some of them. Not as statistics. As people. Bridget Bishop was the first person hanged on the 10th of June 1692. She was the easiest case for the court to begin with. In a terrible way, she had a reputation. She ran a tavern or an inn of some kind, which was already a marginal business for a woman in the eyes of many in the community. She had been accused of witchcraft before, years earlier, in an earlier case that had come to nothing. She wore a black cap, which apparently struck people as unseemly. She had been married 3 times. She had neighbors who claimed she had come to them in their sleep and tormented them. She denied everything, completely and clearly and without wavering. She said she was innocent. She said she knew not what a witch was. She was taken to Proctor's Ledge, a rocky outcropping on the edge of town that served as the execution site, and she was hanged. She was the first. After Bridget Bishop, the court had crossed a line it could not uncross. An innocent woman was dead. The only way to make that mean something, the only way to make the entire enterprise not be a murder, was to believe that she had been guilty. And believing she was guilty meant believing the framework, which meant continuing. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old. 71 years old, and she was someone's grandmother, and she was well known in the community as a devout and kind woman. When the jury heard her case, they came back with a not guilty verdict. Not guilty. In the midst of all of this, 12 men looked at the evidence against Rebecca Nurse and said, "We do not think this woman is a witch." The judge, William Stoughton, who was the chief judge of the court of oyer and terminer and who conducted these proceedings with a fervor that went beyond judicial duty into something that looks, from this distance, like zealotry, sent the jury back. He told them to reconsider. He pointed specifically to a comment nurse had made during the trial, in which she referred to another confessed which as one of us. Nurse insisted she had simply meant that the woman was also a prisoner. She had meant no more than that. The jury went back in, and the pressure of the room, the weight of the expectation, the specific targeting of that phrase by the chief judge, it was too much. They came back with a guilty verdict. Rebecca Nurse was excommunicated from her church. She was hanged on the 19th of July 1692. Think about what that means. A 71-year-old woman, a grandmother, a respected church member who had lived her entire life in this community, had her jury's not guilty verdict reversed by a judge who sent them back with an implicit instruction, was excommunicated, cast out of the community of the saved, formally stripped of her spiritual standing, and was hanged. Because some children said her specter had come to them in the night. And I need to tell you about Giles Corey. Giles Corey was 80 years old. His wife Martha had already been accused and would be executed. And when Giles was accused, he made a choice that remains extraordinary after all this time. He refused to enter a plea. This was a specific legal decision with a specific legal consequence. In the English legal tradition of the time, a defendant who refused to enter a plea could not be tried. But the court had a response to this. It was called peine for dur, hard and forceful punishment. The defendant would be taken to a field and laid on the ground and heavy stones placed on their chest, slowly, over days, until they either entered a plea or died. No one had used peine forte et dur in Massachusetts before. But the court used it on Giles Corey. For 2 days, they laid stones on an 80-year-old man. For 2 days he lay in that field and they added weight. There are accounts, from the sheriff, from witnesses, of his tongue protruding from his mouth and being pressed back in. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. There is a particular kind of moral accounting that history demands of the people inside it, and most of those people fail the test. That's not a cynical observation, it's just an honest one. Guilt is a difficult country to live in, and most people, given the choice, choose to live somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere that requires less of them. So let me tell you what happened to the people who had been at the center of it all. What they did with what they'd done. Some of it will anger you. Some of it will move you. One small part of it, I think, will give you something like hope. Start with Samuel Parris. The minister. The man whose household, whose very parlor, was the origin point of everything. The man whose daughter and niece first fell into fits. The man whose sermons throughout the crisis had been thunderous, accusatory, soaked in the language of demonic conspiracy. Parris had preached as the condemned were carried to Gallows Hill. He had testified against members of his own congregation. He had been, if not the engine of the trials, then the furnace that kept the engine hot. After the trials ended, the community of Salem Village turned on him, which was, in some ways, justice, though of a very limited and self-serving variety, because many of the same people who turned on Parris had believed every word he said when he was saying it. The congregation that had cheered his sermons now refused to pay his salary. Legal disputes erupted over the title to the minister's house. A faction within the congregation, led by men who had lost family members to the gallows, demanded that he be removed. Parris did, in 1694, offer a statement, a partial, careful, heavily qualified document called Meditations for Peace, in which he acknowledged that he had made some errors of judgment and expressed sorrow for the suffering of those who had been wrongly accused. But read it carefully and you will notice what is missing. He does not say he was wrong about witchcraft. He does not say the court was wrong. He does not name the people he helped put on the gallows and say, plainly, that they were innocent. His apology is the apology of a man managing his reputation, not a man reckoning with his conscience. In 1696, Samuel Parris left Salem Village. He moved from town to town for the rest of his life, Stowe, Sudbury, Dunstable, working as a minister, a teacher, a trader, never settling, never returning. He died in 1720. Whatever he thought about Salem in those final years, he kept it to himself. Now in Putnam Jr. you need to understand who Ann Putnam Jr. was, in the context of the trials. She was 12 years old when it began. She would become one of the most prolific and devastating accusers of the entire crisis, providing testimony against person after person, her words carrying enormous weight in the courtroom. Her family was at the center of many of the social and economic tensions in Salem Village. Her father, Thomas Putnam, had long-standing disputes with neighbors and rivals, and some historians have noted, carefully, that many of the people and accused happened to be people her family had conflicts with. Whether Ann was a conscious instrument of her father's grievances, or whether she genuinely believed what she was saying, or whether she had begun believing it and then discovered the power it gave her, that is a question that cannot be answered with certainty now. What can be answered is this. In 1706, 14 years after the trials, Ann Putnam Jr. stood before the congregation of Salem Village and a statement was read aloud in her name. She was by then 26 years old. Both her parents were dead. She was caring for her younger siblings. And she said, in that statement, that she had been an instrument of Satan, that she had been deluded, that she was deeply sorry for the suffering she had caused. She asked, specifically, for forgiveness from the families of those she had accused. It is the only public apology ever made by any of the accusers. Not one other person who had pointed a finger and sent someone to the gallows ever stood up in public and said, "I was wrong. I am sorry. I did this." Just Ann Putnam Jr., 26 years old, standing in church, having her contrition read aloud to the community. Whether it was enough, whether anything could be enough, is not mine to say. But she said it. She is the only one who did. She never married. She died in 1716 at 37. She had lived her entire adult life in Salem. Now let me tell you about Judge Samuel Sewall, because this is where the story turns, briefly and genuinely, towards something better than what surrounds it. Samuel Sewall had been one of the 9 judges on the court of Oyer and Terminer. He had presided over death sentences. He had been, in the language of the law, complicit in the executions of 19 people. And 5 years later, in January of 1697, on a day that had been officially set aside in Massachusetts for fasting and reflection on the calamity of the trials, Samuel Sewall did something that almost no one in his position had done, and very few in any position of power have done before or since. He stood up in the Old South Church in Boston. He handed a written statement to the minister Samuel Willard, and he stood, head bowed, while Willard read it aloud to the congregation. In it, Sewall took the blame and shame of the trials upon himself. He asked forgiveness of God and of the families of the victims. He expressed his desire to take the blame, as he put it, and shame of it. And he stood there, in public, in front of everyone he knew, and bore it. Think about what that requires. Not just the humility, though God knows that's rare enough in a powerful man, but the willingness to be permanently diminished in the eyes of your world. To say, in public, with your name attached, "I did this. I was wrong. I am sorry." Samuel Sewall did not lose his position. He went on to serve as Chief Justice of Massachusetts. But he carried what he had done with him, openly, and he said so, and that matters. He also, in the years that followed, wrote and published one of the earliest anti-slavery tracts in American history. Whether the experience of Salem, of watching the machinery of accusation destroy the innocent, had opened something in him, we can only speculate. But the through line is there, if you want to see it. And then there is Betty Paris. 9 years old. The minister's daughter. The first. She had fits in January of 1692. She was sent away to stay with relatives in Salem town fairly early in the crisis. Her father apparently concluded, or perhaps hoped, that she would calm down away from the environment of the village. She was not one of the major accusers. She was the spark, not the fire. Betty Paris grew up. She moved away from Salem. She married a man named Benjamin Barron. She had children. She lived a quiet life in Concord, Massachusetts. She died in 1760 at 77 years old. What Betty Paris thought about Salem for the remaining 68 years of her life is not recorded. What she told her children or her grandchildren about those months in 1692 when she was 9 years old and the world she had grown up in suddenly split open, we don't know. Whether she remembered, whether she tried to forget, whether the memory of it came to her in the night. We don't know. And somehow that silence, that complete absence of record, is its own kind of weight. Chapter 8. What caused it? Here is where I have to be honest with you, in the particular way that history requires honesty. Not the honesty of a clean answer, but the honesty of genuine uncertainty. 3.5 centuries of historians, scientists, psychologists, and social theorists have looked at what happened in Salem in 1692, and they have proposed explanations, each one illuminating some part of the picture, none of them illuminating all of it. I'm going to walk you through the main ones. And then I'm going to tell you what I actually think, which is that the most truthful answer is probably yes and. The first theory is the one that tends to get people excited when they hear it, because it has the appeal of a clean, physical explanation for something that otherwise seems entirely psychological. It's called the ergot hypothesis, and it was proposed in 1976 by a historian named Linda Caporale. Ergot is a fungus. Specifically, it's a fungal infection that grows on rye grain under particular conditions: wet, warm springs followed by cold winters, which is exactly what the climate of the Salem area had experienced in 1691. When ergot-infected grain is milled into flour and baked into bread and eaten by human beings, it can produce something called ergotism, sometimes called St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms of ergotism include hallucinations, convulsions, a crawling sensation on the skin, the feeling of being choked or pricked with pins, burning sensations in the extremities, and episodes of altered consciousness. You will notice, if you remember part 1, that those symptoms map remarkably closely onto what the afflicted girls in Salem were describing. Caporale's hypothesis gained serious attention and has never been entirely dismissed. The geography supports it. The afflicted girls were concentrated in the western part of Salem village, where rye farming was more common. The timing supports it. The fits began in the winter, when grain from the previous year's harvest would have been in heavy use. The physical symptoms support it, at least partially. But, and this is a significant but, not everyone in the village who ate the same grain was affected. Ergotism, when it does occur, tends to affect whole households or whole communities who share a food source. It doesn't selectively afflict a handful of girls and leave their families untouched. The adults in the Paris household ate the same bread as Betty and Abigail. The fits did not spread through contaminated food in any pattern that makes epidemiological sense. So the ergot hypothesis may explain something. It may explain the initial, genuine physical distress of a few of the younger girls, but it cannot explain the months of accusations and courtroom theater that followed. The second theory is the one that most historians today consider the most important single factor, and it is less dramatic but more convincing: mass hysteria, or as it's now more carefully called in psychology, mass psychogenic illness. This is the phenomenon by which shared symptoms, fits, paralysis, blindness, physical pain, spread through a community not because of any physical cause but because of shared anxiety, shared suggestion, and the extraordinary power of the human mind to produce real physical symptoms from psychological distress. Mass psychogenic illness is not imaginary. The symptoms are real. The suffering is genuine. It simply originates in the mind and spreads through social transmission rather than physical contagion. Salem Village in 1692 was an extraordinarily stressed community. Consider what they were living with. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had just had its original charter revoked by the English Crown and was operating under a new, uncertain political arrangement. There had been a devastating smallpox epidemic in Boston just years before. The frontier wars with the indigenous peoples of New England, the conflicts known as King Philip's War and then King William's War, had been catastrophic, driving traumatized refugees into the villages of Essex County, bringing with them stories of massacres and raids that would have saturated the community's imagination with the imagery of sudden, violent death. Several of the afflicted girls had family members who had died in frontier raids. At least one had been orphaned by such a raid. The terror of the frontier was not abstract. It was personal and recent. Into that community of people already living at the edge of what they could psychologically sustain, drop a Puritan theological framework that told you the devil was real and active in the world, that he was always looking for an opening, that the suffering of the innocent was often the work of demonic forces, and you have a community that is, in a sense, primed, ready, waiting for a shape to give to its fear. When Betty Paris and Abigail Williams began having fits, they gave the fear a shape. And the shape spread. Because that is what fear does in communities that share a worldview. The third theory shifts the lens from psychology to sociology, and it is in some ways the coldest and most illuminating of all. It looks at who accused whom, maps those relationships onto the known social geography of Salem Village, and finds patterns that are not random. Salem Village, the farming community inland from the more prosperous Salem town, was divided in ways that had been generating conflict for decades. There were disputes over the village's relationship with Salem town. There were disputes over whether the village should have its own independent church. There were disputes over who should be the minister and how much he should be paid. There were specific long-running legal fights over land boundaries, inheritance, and economic resources that set families against each other in ways that everyone in the village would have known about. When historians mapped the accusations onto these fault lines, something emerged that was not comfortable to look at. The majority of the accused came from one side of these divisions, from families associated with the more prosperous, more eastward, more connected to Salem town part of the community. The majority of the accusers came from the other side, from the Putnam family's network, from the farming western part of the village, from the people who had been on the losing side of various land and church disputes. This does not mean the accusations were straightforwardly calculated. Human beings don't work that cleanly. But it does suggest that the witch trials gave expression to grievances and resentments that had been building for years, that the accusation of witchcraft was, among other things, a weapon that the community's less powerful faction found and used against those who had more. The fourth theory is the one that is hardest to sit with, because it requires us to look at the possibility that some of the accusers, particularly the older girls, the teenagers, the young women, knew, at least partly, what they were doing. That this was, at some level, performance, conscious manipulation. And here is the uncomfortable thing. There is evidence for it. Several accusers later privately admitted, or heavily implied, that they had been acting. One woman, years after the trials, reportedly confessed privately that the whole thing had been a pretense. The variety and escalating drama of the afflictions, the increasingly theatrical fits, the accusations that spread conveniently to exactly the people the accusers had reason to want accused, suggest, to some historians, a level of agency that sits uneasily alongside the idea of pure innocent delusion. But this theory, too, is incomplete on its own. Because even if some of the older accusers were conscious actors in a drama they had partly written, that doesn't explain why the judges believed them. It doesn't explain why the community believed them. It doesn't explain why respected ministers and magistrates put people to death on the basis of testimony that, if you read it with modern eyes, is transparently impossible. The girls may have been performing, but the audience believed the performance. And the audience is responsible for what it did with what it believed. So here is where I land with full intellectual honesty. It was all of these things in different proportions for different people and at different moments. Some of the initial suffering was probably real, physiological, psychological, or both. Some of it spread through the mechanisms of mass psychogenic illness. The accusations followed the existing fault lines of the community's social tensions. Some of the accusers discovered, as it went on, that they had power they had never had before, and some of them used that power with at least partial awareness of what they were doing. And the adults, the judges, the ministers, the governor, the legal machinery of Massachusetts, made choices, real choices, to put people to death on evidence they should have known was insufficient. History is rarely one thing. That's not a cop-out. That's just the truth of it. Chapter 9. What Salem Means. In 1953, a playwright named Arthur Miller sat down and wrote a play about Salem. He called it The Crucible. And if you have been to high school anywhere in the English-speaking world, you have almost certainly read it, or been made to read it, or avoided reading it and watched the film the night before the exam. But even if you know the play well, I want you to think for a moment about why Miller wrote it when he did. The year was 1953. The United States was in the grip of what had come to be called McCarthyism, the aggressive campaign, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy and powered by the House Un-American Activities Committee, to expose and punish alleged communists in American government, Hollywood, academia, and public life. People were called before committees and asked, under oath, to name names, to identify colleagues, friends, people they knew or had known as communist sympathizers. Those who refused to name names were punished. Those who confessed and cooperated, who named others, were often spared. The innocent had no reliable way to prove their innocence. The accused who refused to confess were treated as more suspicious for their refusal, not less. The whole mechanism was a machine for destroying people, and it ran on accusation, and it fed on fear. Miller saw Salem in this. Not as a metaphor he was stretching to fit, but as a genuine structural parallel, an almost eerie repetition of a pattern that American society had apparently not learned to recognize or resist in the 300 years since 1692. He wrote The Crucible not just as a historical drama but as a mirror held up to his own moment. And the mirror was uncomfortable enough that Miller himself was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1956. He refused to name names. He was convicted of contempt of Congress. The conviction was later overturned. The play has never been out of print since it was published. It has been performed in every decade since. It has been translated into dozens of languages and staged on every continent. And this tells you something important about what Salem means, beyond the history, about why this particular story keeps getting told. What Salem gives us is a name for a mechanism, a word for a pattern. When we say, witch hunt, we mean something very specific. The deployment of accusation as a weapon, the impossibility of disproving a charge because denial itself becomes evidence of guilt, the way fear in a community can override reason and compassion and basic human decency, the way ordinary people become complicit in terrible things because the alternative, standing up, saying, this is wrong, refusing to participate, requires a kind of courage that most people, in most times, do not find. They possess when the moment comes. The Crucible has been staged in countries under authoritarian rule. It has been performed in contexts where the audience understood the allegory viscerally, as commentary on the regime they were living under. It has been used as a text by communities processing their own versions of mass accusation, the AIDS crisis, the satanic panic of the 1980s, social media pile-ons, cancel culture debates, political purges. Every generation finds Salem useful because every generation has its own version of it. And this is where I want to say something that might be uncomfortable, and I'm going to say it gently, because we're in the quiet hours and I'm not trying to disturb you. I'm trying to leave you with something true. The question Salem raises is not purely historical. It is personal. It asks, what would you have done? Not what would the best version of you have done, in a calm room with all the information available. What would the actual you have done, in 1692, in a frightened community, under theological and social pressure, surrounded by people you respected who believed the accusations, at a time when the invisible world was as real to you as the floor beneath your feet? I think most of us, if we're honest, are not Samuel Sewell. We are not the ones who stand up in church 5 years later and say, I was wrong, I am sorry, hold me accountable. We are more likely the ones who go along, who believe what our community believes, who tell ourselves that if everyone else can see it then it must be real, who are afraid to be the person who asks the question that might make everyone look at us the way we've been looking at the accused. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. But it is, I think, the reason Salem matters. It is not a story about monsters. It is a story about ordinary people. People who loved their children, who went to church, who had good years and bad years and worries about the harvest. People who were, in almost every way, like us. And who did this? The mechanism is not extinct. That's what Salem keeps reminding us every time we come back to it. Chapter 10. Salem Today. Let me take you to Salem, Massachusetts as it is right now, or as it was the last time I looked at it clearly. Because if you were to visit Salem today, particularly in October, you would find something that is simultaneously a little strange and, I think, genuinely admirable in its honesty. Salem has leaned into it, fully, commercially, sometimes to a degree that makes historians wince a little. There are witch museums and witch shops. There are tours of the accused former homes, tours of the jail, tours of Gallows Hill. There are people in costume on the main streets in October. There are witch hats and broomsticks for sale in every other shop window. The city calls itself the Witch City. It's on the official seal. The local ice hockey team is called the Witches. You can buy a Salem witch snow globe if you need one. And some of this is genuinely, undeniably strange when you think about what happened there. The people who were executed were not witches. They were accused of being witches falsely, and they died for it. Turning their deaths into a Halloween costume is the kind of thing that could make you feel deeply uncomfortable, and perhaps it should. But here is what else is in Salem, and this is the part that I find genuinely moving every time I think about it. In 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, the city of Salem dedicated a memorial to the victims. It was designed by James Cutler, and it sits in a quiet corner of the city, adjacent to the Charter Street Cemetery where some of the judges are buried. It is made of granite. It consists of a series of stone benches, each projecting from a low wall like a shelf. Each bench bears the name of one of the executed, their method of execution, and the date of their death. Carved into the threshold stone at the entrance are the words of protest spoken by the accused, their own words, their actual words, interrupted mid-sentence by the stone wall as you cross into the memorial, as if cut off, as if silenced. As they were silenced, Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Proctor. She was not executed, she survived, but she is remembered. Giles Corey, and on his bench, or in the memory attached to it, those two words, more weight. In the summer and autumn, people leave flowers on the benches. They leave small tokens. On Rebecca Nurse's bench, someone is almost always likely to have left something. She has become a particular focus of grief, perhaps because her story is so clearly the story of an innocent person destroyed, a grandmother hauled out of her sickbed and hanged. People sit with her name. They say it. The contrast between the witch hat shops and the stone memorial is real, and it is uncomfortable, and it is also somehow fitting. Because Salem is not trying to pretend to be something it isn't. It is not hiding what happened under a layer of respectability. It has made an imperfect peace with its history by refusing to look away from it, by putting the names in stone and leaving them there, in public, where anyone can read them, while also allowing the living city to be a living city, with all the imperfection and commercial absurdity that living cities contain. History is messy. Salem wears its mess on its sleeve. And I find that, in a strange way, more honest than the alternatives. Let me take you back now as we come to the end of this. Back before all of it. Back before the courts and the gallows and the confessions and the testimonies that sent people to their deaths. Go back to January of 1692. Salem Village in the deep Massachusetts winter. The ground hard and frozen. The sky low and gray. The congregation gathered on Sundays in an unheated meeting house, breath misting in the air, pressing together for warmth. The fields bare. The border of the known world never more than a day's ride away, and beyond that border, a wilderness that their theology told them was full of the devil's work. In the parsonage, a modest house, drafty, probably too cold even with the fire going, a 9-year-old girl named Betty Paris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams are having a strange winter. They're confined indoors by the cold. They have very little to do. Their world is small and quiet and somewhat frightening in the way that Puritan childhoods could be frightening, full of the weight of sin and damnation and the ever-present possibility of divine punishment. And something happens to them. Something that, in the moment, nobody in that house could have understood or controlled. Something that would, in the months that followed, destroy the lives of 200 people and end the lives of 25. They were not monsters. None of them were monsters. The judges were not monsters. The accusers were not monsters. Samuel Parris was not a monster, though he comes close in those sermons. They were frightened people in a frightening world, who needed an explanation for things they couldn't understand, for illness, for death, for the cold and the dark and the silence, and who found one. The explanation destroyed innocent lives. And the people who used it convinced themselves, most of them, that they were doing what God required. That is the most disturbing part. Not the cruelty. The sincerity. Because cruelty you can name and oppose and refuse. sincerely held conviction that you are doing right, that is harder to see in yourself and harder to stop. Salem asks you to look at that. In yourself. In the communities you belong to. In the moments when the crowd is moving in one direction and the cost of standing still or turning around feels too high. Salem asks you to be the kind of person who pays that cost. And it is honest enough not to promise that most of us will. Now rest. The stones in Salem still have names on them. That is enough. Those names, Bridget, Rebecca, John, Giles, Sarah, Elizabeth, Susanna, they have been in the stone for 30 years, and they were in the records for 300 before that, and they are here now, spoken quietly in the dark by someone who thought their story was worth telling. By you, perhaps, reading them in your mind in this moment before sleep. To say someone's name 400 years later, in the dark, before you close your eyes, that is not nothing. It is the only form of justice we can still offer them now. A small, genuine light across an impossible distance. The acknowledgement that they were here, that they were real, that what was done to them was wrong, and that we remember it, and that in remembering it we honor what they endured, and we try, imperfectly, and always incompletely, but we try, to be better than the fear. Sleep well.